Hi folks, today I'm going to be talking with Chris von Hoffmann. He is the co-writer and director of the upcoming post-apocalyptic thriller Drifter, which hits theaters this coming Friday, February 24th, and then video on demand on iTunes February 28th. Chris, thanks for talking with me today, and I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little about the movie.
The movie basically centers around these two outlaw brothers in this California desert, and they're on this sort of fool's errand road mission to hunt down this man who allegedly murdered their father, and they end up taking this temporary detour when the younger brother is beaten pretty badly by these desert bandits that try to hijack their car, and they take this temporary detour into this town to find some medical assistance, and they do find medical assistance, but they also find this small family, these cannibal savages who have their own agenda and basically hold the brothers captive, and what ensues is this sort of very unconventional, blood-soaked odyssey, descent into hell as the brothers try to escape this town.
I was very pleasantly surprised with Drifter. It didn't follow the rules that most other films abide by, and because of this I felt the movie excelled. One prime example is that we are never really told too much about the two lead characters, brothers Miles and Dominic, played by Aria Emory and Drew Harwood. We know that they're out for revenge for the killing of their father, but the story never goes into too much detail in regards to this aspect, and as a result, they move throughout the film surrounded by a shroud of mystery. Was this a deliberate move on your behalf?
I did want to make the movie as morally ambiguous as I could, and I didn't want to really state exactly what year this is, and I didn't want to state if it's in the future. I didn't want to state any of that. I just wanted to. I sort of looked at it more like a dream, actually, where I just didn't really want to explain anything. I just wanted to have the movie move moment to moment, and I really didn't want. Because there's so many survival movies of this sort of storyline, they just kind of really bore me. I feel like the whole third act is we gotta fight them now, we gotta fight back, and we gotta be heroic now. And I just didn't really want to go down that route. I was thinking of more films like Martyrs, the French film, or there's this Belgian film called Calvaire, which I pulled similar structural elements from that. They just really went a very unconventional route with how the brothers escape, and I just wanted to feel much more like a descent into hell than anything else.
And you mentioned Martyrs as well. I actually saw the American remake, and I wasn't too impressed, but then I saw the original, and I was like, oh, this is good. So I can see where you got that from.
Yeah, the original's pretty rough movie.
It is, very much so. Well, having mentioned that the two brothers are seeking vengeance, I loved the idea that this element of the story is initially seen as the driving force of the movie, but it never comes to fruition because once they arrive in the small town of Demel, everything changes and we never get to see them take revenge. And again, this is an aspect that in most other films we would typically follow it through, like you said, to the bloody conclusion. So using misdirection, you grab the audience, hinting that the story is going to go in one direction, but then it ends up going in another. What gave you the idea to follow this unpredictable route?
I mean, I really like high concept stories, and this is sort of my first segue into trying to write a high concept story. And I actually, oddly enough, way back when in the early stages of conceiving the story, the subplot with the father was actually much more enhanced, and there were two other scenes that were explaining way too much of that subplot and being way too expositional, and I just felt like it needed to be. Those scenes need to be removed and need to trim it down as much as possible to keep it extremely, to not be so much about that as it is about the town. And I just like kind of leading people down, a set of breadcrumbs and just sort of making a left turn and making a right turn and making a left turn and just sort of kind of screwing around with people's expectations. Because I kind of. I watch movies religiously, and I feel like at this point I sort of more or less understand the beats that certain movies play by, and it's just kind of fun to, twist that up a little bit.
Well, it's something that really stood out for me because, like yourself, I'm a filmmaker as well, and I also love watching movies, and I feel many of today's films just follow convention. So when I saw this, and like you said, it took a left turn, then it took a right turn, it threw me off in a good way, and I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting. So it kept my attention the whole way through, so that's what I loved about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'd say, because, obviously, that sort of structure, that sort of storytelling is a very specific sort of storytelling, and maybe that doesn't work for everybody. I think films more recent films that would probably, I guess, maybe compare this structure to is films like Jim Mickles' Cold in July, which came out in 2014, which I think is a fantastic movie, and it also sort of like Kevin Smith's Red State. I think those two films have sort of like a similar genre, hopping kind of a structure.
Right. Well, I found your shooting style to be very reminiscent of early John Carpenter, and I noticed that you used a couple of deep focus shots, and that is where the camera uses a split focus and is able to focus on the foreground and the background simultaneously, a technique Carpenter employed in many of his earlier movies, including Halloween, The Fog, and The Thing. Was Carpenter a big influence on your career?
Yeah, I mean, like, Carpenter's definitely, I mean, I love him. I've seen pretty much, like, every single interview and every one of his movies, and, I remember buying the CD soundtrack of Vampires when I was, like, 13 years old. It's such an awesome soundtrack. But, like, I mean, he's just, I just, an enormous amount of respect for him, because he's, I really actually think he should, like, teach and be a professor at a film school, because the way he articulates filmmaking, he just says it in a very nuts and bolts, very simplistic way, and he's very, like, sort of like a no-nonsense kind of attitude, but he's very blunt about things, but not, not being, like, mean about it. He's very straightforward and very genuine.
Yeah.
So you really, like, through a lot of his interviews, and just seeing him articulate the filmmaking process, and then watching his films growing up, I just really like his very blunt, very cynical approach to filmmaking with his characters. I mean, his movies have very cynical undertones, and I really enjoy, like, cynical, sort of like mean-spirited undertones to movies, but make them fun at the same time.
Right.
He was, he's definitely been, like, an enormous influence on me. I just love everything he represents, really.
Well, he shot many of his earlier films in widescreen using the anamorphic 2:35:1 aspect ratio, and he said he adapted that approach because at the time, the late 70s and early 80s, he felt it gave his movies a more professional look, and in watching Drifter, I couldn't help but notice that she shot it in the same aspect ratio. Was this another nod to Carpenter?
I mean, I don't know if that was probably like more of like a subconscious thought. I just feel like, regardless of what it is, just try to make it as big as possible, and that's always been my mindset, to just go beyond the budget number, and I just like shooting, and especially a movie about the California desert. I mean, like, you sort of, in order to do that justice, I feel like you need to shoot in wide to really, expose that landscape as much as possible. But I just like shooting things with as big of a scope as possible, despite, the micro budget,
Right, right.
That was definitely a subconscious thought of Carpenter, because I know he's been doing that ever since, like, Assault on Precinct 13, I think.
Exactly. Well, in watching Drifter, I was reminded of three movies, Mad Max, The Hills Have Eyes, and The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, with your film acknowledging all three of them. Which of these movies in particular, or was it all three, inspired you to write and direct Drifter?
I mean, I probably have seen The Hills Have Eyes and The Texas Chain Saw Massacre many times than I've seen Mad Max. I love the Mad Max movies, and I love, like Road Warrior, and actually, I think Thunderdome is probably like my favorite, just because it's just so over the top and so big and grand and out of control. But,
right.
But I mean, actually, like the remake of Hills Have Eyes, Alex Aja film, was far more inspirational on this than the Wes Craven 77 version. But the original Texas Chain Saw Massacre, as well as the sequel that Tobe Hooper made in 1986, were very inspirational in the movie. I just like the idea of not explaining anything and just having this sort of, whacked out, trying to make it. I just really appreciate the relentlessness and the, ruthlessness of those movies, and like, they're pretty nasty movies, and I try to make this movie as nasty as I could, with the budget I had, and so I really appreciated like just the violent tone those movies had more than anything.
Just out of curiosity, which did you prefer, Texas Chainsaw or the sequel? Because I know a lot of people actually preferred the second one over the original, but the original still has an element to it that I don't think can ever be topped. And in many ways, because it was a low budget, I think it worked. Out of the two, which would you say is your personal favorite?
It's sort of like, my viewpoint on like Exorcist and Exorcist 2 Heretic. It's like I like them both for completely different reasons, and I do think Texas Chain Saw Massacre 2 was a much better made film than Exorcist 2, but I think I probably have to say, if I had like a gun to my head, I'd probably say Texas Chain Saw Massacre 1, just because of its like rawness, and it's like just mean-spirited tone, and like but I also love the sequel because it's just so ridiculous, and it's just classic canon films, just schlock, and like so it's and it's also gorier too, and I love the opening scene. I love Caroline Williams; she's like one of my favorite character actresses, and but yeah, I'd probably have to say the first one though, just because of the rawness.
Right, and kind of like Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 as well.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Well, with many of today's horror movies, filmmakers typically leave their endings wide open in the off chance that their film makes money, they can go back and make a sequel. And in the case of Drifter, while I personally felt you wrapped up everything at the end, I could also see a continuation with the story's one surviving character, or even a bunch of new characters. As the creator, is Drifter a once-off, or do you think you might return to the town of Demo one day?
There was talks way back when we were developing the project that just sort of half kidding about it, that it would be kind of cool to make a graphic novel sequel centering on the brothers and how this guy killed their father and sort of expand on that subplot. But I feel from a business standpoint, it'd be better to just to enhance the world of the cannibals. And I feel like with sequels, I love sequels that kind of explore completely new characters.
Yeah.
Sort of how Nightmare on Elm Street 2 just with a completely new residents of the house, and it was completely new story. So it's if there ever was a sequel to the movie, I think it would be great to just have this new group of cannibals that live in another aspect of the town, because that town was very large, and those essentially were the only people living in that town. Sort of like a Hills Have Eyes too. They sort of expanded on that as well.
Right.
But frankly, I actually wouldn't really be interested in myself directing a sequel to it. I would love to be a producer on it or something, or develop the story. But I don't know. I just have a billion stories in my head that I want to make, and I just wouldn't want to kind of go back to the well with directing that story. But I would totally want to be involved in it somehow.
Right. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. You mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I think it's one movie that's always been overlooked, and I'm a big lover of orchestral music, and I think it's the one movie other than Wes Craven's New Nightmare that had the best soundtrack. And if you look at all the trailers for every Elm Street movie, they pretty much take one of the pieces of music from Part 2 and use it in the trailer for every other movie. I bought the soundtrack for Elm Street 1 and 2 years ago, and it was just something I loved. So when you mentioned Elm Street 2, I was like, oh yeah, it's still one of my favorites.
Yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is actually, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, the Rennie Harlan movie, was my favorite growing up as a kid, and it's still probably my second favorite, but Nightmare on Elm Street 2, I think, was the last installment in the series where Freddy was genuinely creepy and terrifying.
Yes.
And, just the whole weird, it just had a very that strange tone, and I really appreciated the boldness of it. And I'm a big fan of Jack Shoulder. Like, I love The Hidden and like Alone in the Dark, and I just thought that using sort of switching, like using Mark Patton as like the male scream queen, I thought was a really interesting take, and I just thought Marshall Bell was really terrifying as a coach, and and I love Robert Russler, and I thought his death is like really frightening, and I thought that the pool party massacre, even though it makes absolutely no sense, like seeing it's great. I mean, it's just like a great set piece for Freddy to like come in. I just like the whole Avatar, possession aspect to it. I mean, I really think that film is really overlooked. I mean, I totally agree with you, and I feel like it needs to be dissected a lot more than people give it credit for.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you totally. Well, as an indie filmmaker myself, I made my first movie when I was 12 years old, and in the subsequent years made many more shorts, but it was in the year 2000, when I was 28 years old, I made my first feature. And the reason was because I didn't feel ready to tackle a feature before then. And you've made a lot of short movies yourself dating back to 2004, but Drifter is your feature film directorial debut. Was there a reason you waited until now to make your first feature?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to, because I just sort of been around, I had seen too many people that had thought that short films were beneath them and that sort of jumped into making a feature film when they were like 22, 23, just like a DIY approach. And the feature films just looked terrible, and they were like problematic all over the place, and they looked like student films that they made in their backyard. And I just felt my feature film filmography was just too important to me, and I wanted to make sure if I'm going to screw up a lot with like technicalities and all that, I'd rather do that with short films, because once I make my feature film, that's part of my filmography now. So I just wanted to make sure that my first feature was as confident as I could possibly make it from an aesthetic standpoint, and I needed to make as many short films as possible to sort of screw up as much as possible, and just really understand what it is I have to offer to movies and what is the void that I have to fill. Because I feel like just jumping into a feature film, I feel like that's just not, I feel like that's not really respecting the medium. I feel like I needed to be a little bit more patient than that.
It's one of the smartest answers I've had from, and like I said, being a filmmaker for 30 years, I've met a lot of other filmmakers who jumped right in, and then, like you said, their first feature was all over the place. It looked like a student movie, badly edited, bad sound. And kind of like yourself, I was the same way. I made a lot of shorts and learned from them. So by the time I got to my first feature, it was much improved. So yeah, that's a really great answer. It's quite obvious in watching Drifter that you learned much over the years from making your shorts. And I think too many filmmakers today, like we said, are too impatient and jump straight into making features, bypassing shorts altogether with little or no experience. What advice would you give to an aspiring filmmaker who wants to jump into a feature having never made a short?
I feel like they should definitely make as many short films as possible before they make a feature film. But if they want to jump right into a feature film, they just have to understand that it's not going to be, it's most likely not going to be very good, and you just have to understand that you're going to have a lot of babies that are, you're going to have a lot of, I guess, ugly children before you make, if you just keep on making these like DIY feature films and refuse to make any short films, you're just going to have a lot of, I guess, ugly children
right.
before you really get there. And I think you just need to. It's really about I think a lot of people that want to be filmmakers are just there's like a lack of patience.
Yeah.
With people these days, and I feel like people think that they're above short films. Like I watch these like educational videos or whatever about like these like filmmakers are talking about short films are beneath them and like there's no market for them. It's like yeah, okay. I mean, short films can only go so far, and
right.
they can't get like really distributed and go too far. But that's not what they're about. That's about you as an individual, learning and treat it as like an unofficial film school. And I don't understand why people can't look at it from that angle. And not, your short films don't have to set the world on fire. They just have to, just enhance your skill. And I think like my advice is just. Really be patient and really make as many shorts. Make short films don't just make like one short film. I mean, make as many short films as possible, all different lengths. Grab like the crappiest, ugliest camera that you could find, and don't focus on the lighting. Don't focus on the set. Just make a short film. Grab some actors and focus on the story and focus
right.
on the characters. And then the more and more you do that, each better camera you get for each film you make, you'll have more of an appreciation for the story. And I mean, the first short I ever shot on, the first camera I ever used was like a VX1000 camera, and this is like 2009, and that camera was from like 1999. So it's like there can't be too many people just want to like grab like the flashiest camera to make their first film because they're like, I don't know, they're self-conscious but don't worry about what other people think. Just you got to focus on your own aesthetic.
Yes, that's really great advice. My nephew, he's 10 years old, and he's seen some of my movies, and now he wants to make his first feature film, and he's 10, and I'm like, no. I said, go out with the camera.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And like you said, just hone your craft and get familiar with the camera, with the lighting, and eventually work up to features. Well, one last question then. Can you tell us if you're working on any upcoming projects?
Yeah, I'm in a pre-production for this movie that we're shooting later in the spring. It's been a long process. It's finally moving forward, and it was just like the entire year of 2016 was basically just dedicated to rewrites and rewrites and rewrites and rewrites on the script. And it's like the first movie that I'm making with a production company and with like higher up people. I'm essentially just writing and directing this movie, which is completely different for me. I've just never written and directed a movie, so it's an interesting process. Now, I do think it's a major step up on every level from Drifter, but more importantly, just in the script and the story, and just because like my first movie was sort of like I knew I wanted to make it as personal as possible, and I just wanted to make my first movie as sort of like a deconstruction of genre and like sort of like a love letter to all these movies I've loved since birth, and just get that out of my system. And then for the second movie is much more, I guess a much, just a much stronger story, much stronger script. It's not, it's not so much like a overly stylized comic book
right
sort of movie like Drifter was. It's much more like much heavier on story and character and. I think, and it's just a lot of work has been done on the screenplay for this particular movie, so I'm excited to finally get it on its feet.
All right. Well, that sounds terrific. Well, Well, folks, today I was speaking with Chris von Hoffmann, the co-writer and director of the upcoming post-apocalyptic thriller Drifter, which hits theaters February 24th and video on demand on iTunes February 28th. Chris, thanks so much for talking with me today, and I sincerely hope that Drifter is the hit I hope it will be, and maybe down the line we can chat again about your next feature.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James.